These kind of instruments we used in the 60s. We bought old pianos, put them apart and worked, improvised on them. And Pike threw them on the floor and destroyed them. It was a time when we looked for new sounds, new ways of doing things. And the European Fluxus movement is also different from the American. The European movement grew out of the post-war, after-war hunger and existential needs and the experience of war. It was less a game and it was less funny. And the Americans, they played it. They have war on the TV, then they look TV and they have war. They never had it in their own country. They were never hungry. And the European artists of that generation, the older ones came home from the war and finally thought, now we can do what we wanted to do, namely abstract art, but they were already too old because our generation, we were young and we pushed them aside. So there's a whole generation of artists who came back from the war who had the disadvantage to spend their young years as soldiers, and they came back and they couldn't catch up because they were already, we were children after the war, so we knew enough about hunger and war and horror, but we hadn't shot people. Didn't have the depression of coming home and having killed already people, and that is a difference. So we were always hungry. We were always searching for another way of living, because when you see the enemy coming into the country, the enemy, you sit 5 years in the bunker or have all your relatives shot, and then comes the enemy and throws candies. It was a black guy on a tank who threw candies into the... This is the enemy? Was laughing. No? And that is, for a child, you never believe a grown-up again. I never believed anything again. I wanted always to find out myself. So that was a shock. Also then they said they are poisonous, the candies. So we collected them anyway, and we were a group of children. We were not at home, we were all exported. Hitler exported children to safe countries. So I was in Austria at that time, and we were a group of really hungry children, and we had the candies, and then the grown-up said, oh, this is from the enemy, this must be poisoned. So then we said, we try out. No? And then we said, Mr. Somebody has to try out. It came to me. So I was licking on the thing, and then somebody, is she dying from it? Is it poisonous? So it was really, it took a lot of courage. And then I said, no, it's not. It tastes beautiful. And then we had the candies. And for a child, these are little moments where everything turns around. And a lot of artists, in my studio in the 60s, a lot of these people, philosophers, musicians, they were this kind of war generation, little bit too young to have been called into the war, old enough to have experienced it. And you make different art when you have, the biography is always shaping what you do in art. Stockhausen was actually the inventor of electronic music, and that happened in Cologne. So Cologne became the center of art because of the electronic studio, where Stockhausen was really president. And John Cage from America, he gave a lecture in 1958 in Darmstadt about indeterminacy in art. And this was a breakthrough. Pike changed his whole attitude. He was a Schoenberg student and musician, and that lecture, I was there also, it's changed our mind, because everything until then had programs. Mondrian was a program, Kandinsky, it was either concrete art or taxistic art, or it was serial music. So there were concepts and artists were fixed to their concept. And there comes Cage and opens the window and says, if you want music, open the window. No? And he includes noise or anything. It's all part of music. In my studio, they played 4 minutes, 33 seconds. We didn't know what happened. We had to carry 5 stairs, an expensive piano, and the piano was there, an expensive piano for David Tudor was to sit on the thing, open the thing, and 4 minutes silence. And we listened. And because we waited for something we heard something. We heard breathing, we heard coughing, we heard whistling. So because you always want to hear something, you hear better. So he opened our ears to silence. And in our studio, it was daylight, there came a bird to the window and sang a song while into the silence. So it was chance, but it was incredible. No? And these kind of experiences which Cage brought from America. On the other hand, Cage was influenced by Europe because Albers was teaching in the Black Mountain College, so there was early European influence in America. Cage was there, had students, and then that came back to Europe. So it was really in a European, and Duchamp lived in New York. Duchamp was very important for Cage. So it was really a global kind of exchange, like the Café Voltaire in Zurich, 1916, half a year. International artists came together while their countries were fighting in war against each other. So the artists were already not nationalistic. No? And that was not naturally wonderful that Cage came to Europe, Stockhausen went to America. And we as painters, and Forstel as a graphic artist, he could learn. I learned more from music than from a teacher in art, because it was interesting what the musicians thought. And Cage, for example, he was not a musician like in old times. A musician heard something and he wrote it down. Then Cage didn't hear anything inside. He invented a system how to make music. And then he was listening to his own invention. Oh, interesting, or boring. No? That is a big difference if you come from your own inner experience and want to show it or share it with people, or if you say it doesn't matter what you hear, you have just experienced it. If it's krach, if it's silent, if it's boredom, then they said as boring as possible. Pike made a piece as boring as possible, but it was as aggressive as you could imagine. So they played with words, they played with absurdities, and Cage was in that sense very important because of his concept of freedom, and he brought Zen Buddhism, like Pike also, into Europe. And Stockhausen was an incredible teacher because he shared everything he experienced with the students. He was an incredible teacher. He never kept things for himself. And when it's in the following of Duchamp, all these thoughts come from somewhere, and they had been pointed really to the extreme in the Fluxus movement, because they were very, in the end, very consequent. No? And the fact that it was not meant as art, it was, when they made the multiples and everybody can have art, it was not meant as elite art. And that was the real social impact of it. Now it hangs in the museums, which we didn't want we didn't want the museums. They are mausoleums, no? But in the end, you hang in the museum. I hang in the museum now. Now, is this a compromise, or do I use that the money of the compromise to do something?